And I think over the long run, like perseverance and hard work, like that's probably the bigger variable in explaining like very successful careers and whatnot and whatever. Like that moment where you need to be like extremely cerebral and see the insight that no one can see, that just doesn't occur that often for it to make the difference in a lot of careers, unless you're in like, you know, trying to revolutionize physics or something.
This episode of Ken's Nearest Neighbors is powered by Z by HP, HP's high compute, workstation grade line of products and solutions. Today, I had the pleasure of interviewing DJ Rich. DJ is an educational content creator on YouTube who covers machine learning related topics from reinforcement learning to information theory. As a data scientist at Lyft, he successfully pushed for causal forecasting as the best mechanism for company-wide planning. He'd argue it's the only valid data-driven approach to planning. His graduate education is formally in financial engineering, which he's used as a quant within the hedge fund industry. In this episode, we learn how DJ navigated his career, moving from finance to big tech. We also learn about causal forecasting, a topic that I personally was not familiar with before. And finally, we touch on why DJ thinks that there are big things looming in the future for reinforcement learning. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I know I had a blast speaking with DJ. So DJ, thank you so much for coming on the Ken's Nearest Neighbors podcast.
Yeah.
I found out about you through your YouTube channel, which I really enjoyed. And after we talked a little bit, I also found that you have quite an interesting story working through a hedge fund, now working in essentially big tech as a data scientist. And I'm really interested to learn more about how you've approached your career, how you've approached maybe even your life on that front, and just to get a better understanding of your overall story. So thank you again for coming on the show.
Sure. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me. Yeah. So how did I get into data science? Classic question. I guess a good way to start is sort of like where your passion originally developed. So for me, it was quite a specific experience. So I did my undergraduate degree at Boston College, and like a lot of, mildly studious people, you pick your subject matter because one, you think you'll get good grades, and one, you'll be useful as an employee after the fact. So I went with math and econ. They were like pretty interesting to me, but I was just like, this is probably what employees of a marketplace would be really useful for them. So go with that. There, I actually had a really, remarkable experience of one of my close buddies who's just any college buddy, a drinking buddy, was like extremely interested in mathematics outside of the classroom, which I'd never seen before. So we'd be like going to the gym together, and he'd be like, I'm working on this problem in my head and it's super hard and And I think his experience was he had some high school professor, which was just like next level inspiring. I don't know how it worked out, but he just had the energy from that moment. And so from that really like just that experience with him of sharing in the subject just really opened up my eyes to how like cool it could be. And then for the first time, like this was, maybe sophomore, junior year of college, I started exploring the subject just independent of classroom, which was just crazy. I was like, what can you do with this stuff? And that's where I discovered it's really useful for hedge funds to predict the future. It's used for cancer research. It's used for predicting the weather. I was like, it's useful for everything. Like all the interesting things that we do with respect to information come from some STEM, computer science, mathy world. And that's where I got kind of hooked. I was like, all right, if there's any superpower to be had by humans, this might be it. So that was cool. That was just like a very, exciting experience. Then I went out into the world and I was like, I'm ready to do mathematics for a big fancy company. And they don't really look for undergraduates to do that. So I sort of discovered that, you could get sort of a banking job or one of these sort of grind it out, making slides, Excel spreadsheets types of things, but not the interesting, sexy algorithmic stuff. So I got a financial engineering degree from Berkeley that just seemed like it had sort of the right intersection of computer science and statistics, and it was angled towards the financial services industry. So they fed people in hedge funds, a lot of banks, stuff like that. And so I was like, all right, this is a good place to go. And then once I got there, that was an awesome experience. This was, a ton of really smart people studying just interesting stuff, really thinking one step ahead about how you're going to use it at a big company. And then one of the interesting things is like, it's sort of a classic thing that a trader will have to do. A quant trader was, you develop a strategy and then you back test it and then you see if you generated any alpha relative to the market. And then for the fourth quarter, there was sort of like a challenge put out to the class, or I don't know, it felt like a challenge where the professor said, uh, we were going to do a pairs trading strategy, which is basically you find two stocks that are co-integrated, which means they kind of move in lockstep. And whenever they deviate from that lockstep motion, you can sort of bank on their return to that pattern. And so there's sort of like linear regression ways of doing this. But the professor was like, if you really want to be fancy with this stuff, you can use a neural net and machine learning and all this stuff. I'd never heard that before. But he, warned the class that it was really hard. And so I took that as like a good indicator. I just took that as a challenge. And I worked on it for like, 6 or 8 months trying to get it to work. And it ultimately did not work, but it was enough to hook me into it. I was like, okay, I get this. This idea of like learning insight from historical data and using fancy algorithms to do it that have some analogy to the human brain, like I'm hooked, I'm in. And so from there, it's just been sort of a continuation. From there, I went to a hedge fund called Causal Capital, which is now defunct. But that was really exciting because they were looking for sort of young quants to apply trading strategies and build algorithms and stuff. So that was exciting. There was a lot of money behind it. And so I went from there, then into the credit industry. Well, anyway, I wanted to actually get into tech because my brother was in tech at the time. I was at a hedge fund and tech actually looked a lot more fun. So I had to traverse. And coming out of a boutique hedge fund, you're not really getting attention from the Facebooks and Amazons and Googles and whatnot. So I made a very natural intermediate step to fintech because I happened to know credit at the hedge fund. So I was going into a credit card company. And then that was considered a startup. And then I was able to get attention from other places like, Pinterest and Lyft and whatnot. So I ultimately went to Lyft. And since then, we'll get into more of it, but Lyft has been really exciting. So anyway, I don't want to go on too long. That's the high.
No, it's perfect. It seems like each step in your process was very logical. You went from hedge fund to fintech and like plotted it out. And, you were also thinking in school, it's like, okay, what would give me a lot of opportunities going forward? Even if I don't know exactly what I want to do, you just knew that it was involving math. I'm very interested in your friend as well in that relationship. It seems like you're something that you really enjoy is having conversations with people that are very smart or being around people that are intellectually stimulating to you.
Yeah.
I'm picturing the John Nash in A Beautiful Mind where they're in the bar. They're talking about the like their odds with the women.
I wish I was that good. Yeah.
I feel like that's what he had going on in his head when he's at the gym. That's a really funny one for me. But I also think that it's also very interesting the power of having a good mentor or someone that does show you the way in that sense. So essentially, you got second order inspiration from this guy's really good teacher in high school or whatever it might be. And that's pretty wild if you think about it. Like, it goes so much more beyond what we individually teach. There are these second order benefits and consequences to being like a good teacher or being passionate about the field or creating value for other people, which is really inspiring.
Yeah. Just on that note, getting a good mentor, I feel like it's quite hard, but it's like, this is almost a cliche, but it's extremely important. And I think some people have it in their mind that it's important because they'll teach you a bunch of skills and then they'll sort of like give you what they know. That never really happens. You don't have that much time with a mentor. But one thing that they definitely give you is it becomes easy to relate to them in how they love the subject. Like just the way they speak about it and it comes off on you. Because I only had to have like 3 or 4 conversations, which sort of repositioned my relationship to the subject from something that I was using as a means to the end, like get good grades, get a good job, make some money, versus as something that you could just be independently interested in and it could like occupy your thoughts on a walk. And I was like, oh, I didn't realize that. And so a mentorship can just be, really, really beautiful and impactful for your whole career in that. And they're really hard to find, but they're super important.
Yeah, I think that like an individual mentor is really hard to find, but at the same time, I've been able to find really great mentors through books, for example, through YouTube, through a lot of these platforms where I think the direct connection with someone can be overrated.
Yeah.
Right. You can still get I could probably name 5 books off the top of my head that have like tangibly changed my life. and I've never met the author, right?
Sure.
And it's like, well,
Give me some names. Who are
so Atomic Habits, the one thing, kind of a cliche one, but Awaken the Giant Within by Tony Robbins.
they? Oh, interesting.
Effortless, and on the spot. Come on.
Oh, sorry.
No. I want to say one that's like, the 4 disciplines of execution. That's probably a pretty good one. They're more like operational. There's some like biographical ones. Like I read Thomas Jefferson's biography a while ago, and that was like unbelievably inspiring. Where you see someone, how much shit people can get done without technology is wild, or without distractions. Like if I didn't have a cell phone and all these things competing for my attention, and we didn't have all these different options for entertainment these days, the amount of output that I think I would have is outrageous compared to what I do now. Because I would be doing all of that for leisure rather than scrolling on Instagram or doing whatever it is that's out there, right? But, the other thing is that this guy, the first guy, he was one of your peers, right? And we can learn a lot from our peers and have really good conversations that sort of push each other forward. I think that that's something that I've really weighed in on very heavily over the last couple of years and found tremendous value in. I mean, I had a friend who stayed out with me in Hawaii for a little while, who I'm actually making a course with, Jeff Lee. And just some of the conversations and the like, we probably have very similar values and perspectives, but they're just different enough where you're like, oh, I didn't think of it that way. Maybe I should consider it. Or, I would say something. He's like, oh, yeah, like that relates to these other concepts I was wrestling with, but I couldn't tie it together cohesively like you just described.
Yeah.
And I think a really long way of saying that growth and finding yourself and career and all these things, they don't happen in isolation. It really helps to have other people to bounce these things off of. And it's good to have friends, or good to make friends that you think can help push you either professionally or personally forward in a really cool way.
Yeah, I mean, just a lot. Now that you're talking mentors, and you mentioned ones that you don't actually know. My buddy Tyre, he actually told me about Richard Feynman, and that's like the most cliche scientific inspiration. But I was one of those cases. Like I just found out about this guy, read all his stories, and he's I forget the name of this documentary, but there's a few of these documentaries from the 80s. I forget what it's called, but it's Richard Feynman in a chair talking about science or whatever. It's super famous.
I've seen it on YouTube.
Yeah, I think everyone's seen it. But there's one sign in there, which is, and this is, I mean, it was totally true, but there's a moment where I think if you're in this academic game where you're working alongside other people who are, trying to accomplish the same thing, it's easy to get discouraged because you see that some people are just like really naturally gifted, or they have experience with the subject already or whatever. But sometimes, you're not always the top performer or ever. And so it can be discouraging to make those comparisons. There's one clip from Richard Feynman where he's saying there's no special people. He's like, people just work really hard and they like it. And I'm not sure if that's like entirely true. It's probably not. But it was really amazing to see like a severely top guy be like, we're just people. Like, you just figured it out. And again, I'm not sure if it's probably not 100% true, but it was extremely important for me to hear. To be like, oh, if it's all just hard work, then I could just do that and then you'll be fine. And I think over the long run, like perseverance and hard work, like that's probably the bigger variable in explaining like very successful careers and whatnot and whatever. Like that moment where you need to be like extremely cerebral and see the insight that no one can see, that just doesn't occur that often for it to make the difference in a lot of careers, unless you're in like, trying to revolutionize physics or something. But in our world, like I think it's a lot of just like, are you willing to look at every corner of the data? Are you willing to try 15 different models? Like, does the subject of data science just get you obsessive? Do you care about first principles, stuff like that? And then you can sort of like accrue this level of intelligence. Anyway, it's kind of a tangent.
I love that so much. I want to dive into that more. It's something I've been sort of rolling around with is, I've been training a lot of jiu-jitsu recently. It's something I can't stop thinking about, apparently can't stop talking about either. But one of the things I find very interesting is, I go into that sport. Do I have natural talent? if I'm more competitive when I start, or throughout the 32 years I've been alive, do I have more things that have overlapped with it that make me see it in a certain way or make my body apt for it in a certain way than other people? Or do other people have more of a diverse background that lends itself to it than I do? So it's not necessarily just having natural talent for something. It's having a lot of things that slightly overlap with what you're doing. And so you see it in just a different way than maybe the layman does or most other people do. So for example, in high school, I wrestled. So it's like, oh, I've grappled in some sense before.
Yeah.
So maybe I have a leg up when I start. And if someone is comparing themselves to me starting at 32 also and doing whatever, that's probably not a fair comparison.
Yeah.
And they shouldn't be comparing themselves to me, because there's something in the history, not in the natural ability, that makes us different. But that's so hard to tease out.
Yeah.
But it is undoubtedly valuable.
Yeah.
And I think people, for example, if someone's coming into data science from a physics background, there's probably an area of simulation. There's probably an area of the natural sciences that they're applying that's going to give them a leg up in certain types of scenarios or shape their thinking about certain types of problems.
Yeah.
So they're probably going to see something that's different for me, who studied like economics and computer science.
Yeah.
But when it comes to like implementation and speed of an algorithm, I might have a better understanding of that just from my unique background.
Yeah.
And I think people just don't consider it. They look at everyone peer to peer, apples to apples, and it's just very, very much not the case.
It's not the case. Yeah, you just got to get your reps in. By the way, I hope you can't hear the construction back there. There's some.
No, I can't at all.
Oh, thank God.
You sound great.
Yeah, good. Because I hear knocking and shouting, and I'm like, all right, thank God.
No. You're in a good spot. So, that was a little bit of a tangent, but as people know who listen to the podcast, I quite enjoy tangents. This episode is brought to you by Z by HP, HP's high compute, workstation grade line of products and solutions. Z is specifically made for high performance data science solutions, and I personally use the ZBook Studio and the Z4 workstation. I really love that Z workstations can come standard with Linux, and they can be configured with the data science software stack. With the software stack, you can get right to work doing data science on day one without the overhead of having to completely reconfigure your new machine. Now back to our show. I am interested, maybe starting earlier in your career, what was your experience like working at a hedge fund? Was it what you thought it would be going in? What were some of the good parts and maybe some of the parts that you didn't quite enjoy as much? Yeah,
so from a distance, it definitely checked the boxes that I was going for. Like the way I thought about it before I got in, I was like, I got this tool set that I've trained myself with. And the only way that it's going to get better over time is if me applying that skill set matters in terms of dollars. Like if you're off doing research that no one expects to ever return any money, like you could do whatever. It doesn't really matter. And there are a lot of pockets of science that are unfortunately like that. So this was very much like I had a certain skill set. I wanted I wanted a company that was going to put money behind it and I could see the results. And I was like, if I'm going to be put under that pressure, I'm going to get those skill sets good. It's just going to matter too much not to do that. So I went to a company called Causal Capital. It was around for a few years, and they were spinning up a peer-to-peer lending portfolio, which is like a fixed income portfolio. Basically, there are these companies, Prosper and Lending Club, and they had this innovative idea where it wasn't going to be an institution that lent you money. It was going to be another Joe Schmo peer that was just going to lend you money. So individuals would go online and be like, I'll give this guy $15,000 and he's going to give me a 12% interest rate, something like that. So I was part of this hedge fund that had this one fixed income portfolio that I worked with another guy on. And our idea was to just go to Prosper and Lending Club and a couple other companies and figure out how to cherry pick these loans. I was like, that's perfect. Like loan valuation is actually like there's some reasonably heavy mathematical machinery in there. You're dealing with kind of rare events. It's definitely a place where machine learning could fit in. And these loans were like 12 months to 5 years. So I was going to have some time to actually see whether these investments were good. And so it was really exciting. I was there for 3 years. And I would say it was really exciting for the first 18 months because that's when I got to build the whole system. I got to build this back tester and, create all these hazard curves and do Markov transition matrices for delinquencies to default and just all the fancy stuff that I'd wanted. And I was able to come up with a pretty good a rank ordering of loans to pick, and it was exciting. But eventually, after that, like once the science is kind of sort of figured out, I mean, it was kind of a small team, so I'm not going to say it was entirely figured out. But once we got to the diminishing returns, my life became more oriented around sort of the other realities of working at a hedge fund. Things like, we had this individual portfolio that we were trying to advertise to clients. So I was going to clients, explaining them what the strategy is, how we expect it to fare in a downturn and whatnot. But I was also, this is just one portfolio in a larger hedge fund, which has other types of strategies. So I saw all sorts of different types of strategies. Some of them were very statistical arbitrage, cool stuff that I admire. But other types were just sort of kind of seemed reminiscent of kind of like the 80s trader, where someone sort of just like has an intuition, what they read recently, some sort of innate instinct for where the market's going, and they bet on that. And I'd never seen that before. And coming from financial engineering and sort of my background, I didn't even think that was really a survivable strategy anymore. I didn't realize that there were these sort of, speculators who would just not necessarily have a back-tested strategy to figure out why they're picking certain stocks. They would read the news or have a strong opinion about what the government's going to do or what the Fed's going to do, any sort of stuff like that. And those strategies were next to my strategies. I kind of think of them as like sort of cowboys and scientists. And over time, I kind of thought that wasn't necessarily a great juxtaposition because I think science only really works if it's pervasive throughout the entire institution. And that's one reason why I really like Lyft. But you really need everyone to understand the merits in the scientific approach, because science in the day-to-day, in the 3-month, 6-month time horizon, it's very expensive and it's very disappointing because you have to have a scientific infrastructure. You have to have an adherence to best practices about what you can and can't say about the data. And science gives you a lot of like intermediate disappointing answers. So the way I kind of think about it is like the Cowboys are only going to figure out whether their strategy doesn't work when they look at the P&L. And then by that point, everyone has their own excuse for, why something didn't work out. But they find out at the late, and they can be right. Like they are aware of information that a model often isn't aware of. So there's good reason to think about those Cowboy strategies. But science, its robustness comes from the fact that I think that it can more quickly tell you when something's not going to work. So you have a new data source that you just found out about, and is that good? And it can more quickly tell you, we back tested it. It has no correlation with the future. Get rid of that. But that's a disappointing intermediate error. And sometimes people just don't want to deal with that. And it's expensive to check those answers. So it's a lot quicker to just have an instinct for how the market's going to go and then bet on that. And if you actually do have a good instinct, which some people do, then that can be really hard against the statistical arbitrage sort of, eke out alpha over time. And I just felt like the comparisons weren't necessarily fair, so, and ultimately, like I was, after a certain point, I was like, all right, I probably won't do this forever. But then inadvertently, just at that same time, the hedge fund went under for some, spectacular bets on other portfolios that sort of explained a lot of the variance of the hedge fund's performance over the recent past. And so the whole thing got wiped out. I was like, I'm ready to leave anyway. So it turned me off from the entire hedge fund space. And so I was like, I like the science. I like that stuff, but I'm ready to leave.
Yeah, I think that the Cowboys versus scientists phenomenon is exemplified in finance, or in probably in hedge funds specifically. To me, that's something I was talking about sports analytics in the last episode that I did. And there's a short-term versus long-term trade-off. Like the strategies that individuals use to pick things based on instincts, it won't necessarily survive them, right? Like they are the model, and that's okay. That could be really good. You can make billions of dollars doing that. But after you stop, what happens?
Yeah.
I think the science and the infrastructure is something that is scalable and repeatable, and you don't have to worry about, some hedge fund manager like getting in a car crash and your whole portfolio going under, right? I mean, that to me is unbelievably scary. I mean, it's pretty hard to quantify or to replicate the exact decisions an individual person makes. And sometimes they can't even articulate what makes them do certain things. And you do see immediate returns with someone, taking massive positions based on things that they read or see or inherently understand. And you do see these unbelievably like slow returns on analytics or data science or any of these models in the short term. But you look 5 years out and you look at maybe 10 companies that use, let's say 100 companies that are focusing mainly on quantitative strategies, and 100 companies that are focusing mainly on cowboy strategies.
Oh yeah.
I think we would both agree that the ones that are using more quantitative, more science-based strategies, a larger percentage of them will be around after 10 years or will have greater returns over 10 years. You might have those anomalies where it's like, one or two of those will make returns far greater than any of the ones in the quantitative group. But that's because of unique talents or individual people or luck. And I would hope, at least for me, I'm trying to remove luck from all of my finances, right? That's like one of the staples of what I've been trying to do over the last 10 years.
Yeah. And I think just to clarify, I don't think anyone out there would fully subscribe to the idea of being a cowboy where it's like you just read the paper and then you make your bets. Everyone has some sort of sprinkle of quantitative strategy. And there's a lot of, I'm throwing shade at somebody here, but there's a lot of like just bad science out there where people will sort of do some sort of flimsy quantitative analysis, or they'll we've seen this, I'm not going to say p hacking, but something akin to that, where you sort of look at the data from 50 different angles such that your thesis looks plausible.
To see what you like.
What is that?
Look at it in a bunch of different angles till you see what you want.
Yeah, exactly. And we've seen that, you've seen that a lot. It's really disappointing, but I see you could be forced to do bad science. We're like, can we make the data say this? It's like the data doesn't say that. And so, so I think everyone needs to be quantitative these days, but the people who are really doing it, they're very sort of boring in the short run, and it just takes a long time for them to kind of separate. But they do separate, and by this point, we've had a lot of mature hedge funds. I think if you look at the top 10 hedge funds, I think 8 of them are ground up quantitative strategies or whatever. So,
well, I want to emphasize the point that you just described. You see that a lot across a lot of industries where people want the data to confirm what they're already saying. They're not necessarily looking at the data to tell the story itself. And I think that that's inherently dangerous, and probably one of the biggest problems that data scientists run into on a regular basis is this confirmation bias that a lot of people have. It's like, oh, the data says what I want. Great. I'm going to go with it. The data doesn't say what I want. It must be wrong, or, rerun your models or whatever it might be. And I don't really know what the solution is to that, rather than cultural reform or re-education or better, storytelling on our part. But it is, data without a doubt is more subjective, or is interpreted more subjectively than almost every STEM person believes it should be going into the domain, right? I think that, what part of this podcast is educating people on what they could expect. And that is something that I absolutely did not expect going into this domain. And it's something I see with every company I've probably ever worked with.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes the data just has kind of bad news, and, you can be staring at it, and some people are just like, well, is that really? It's like, no, I promise you, if it was saying good news in exactly the same way, you wouldn't be doubting it. So you got to kind of have to be a straight shooter with respect to data. But it can also be very subtle. So it's always.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point. On the other side of it, I think that data science can be overly scientific. If we're looking at specifically p-values, for example, where it's like, we can run 2 ads, and if one is still performing better over time, even if it isn't a significant difference, why not still run that ad or both ads? Because you still have to choose between the two, right? There's no financial negative, or the expected value isn't negative of running one over the other.
Yeah.
And so it's like sometimes we get overly scientific, and sometimes I think that this just goes to say that the domain, you have a lot of maybe question marks still, and that's part of the fun of it is navigating those.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. This reminds me of I see a bias that a lot of data scientists had that I 100% had, which is like you show up at a company, it has a certain business problem, which requires data science of some form. You need to infer some insight from the data and build a model to whatever. But a lot of biases that people have is like a lot of these data science people are really plugged into the data science world, like the influencer world or whatnot. And there's a lot of research that's happening, a lot of exciting ideas. And people can be really tempted to take the most interesting, exciting research paper and try to use it for their problem right there. And it doesn't acknowledge that there's a big life cycle between something getting proposed in a research paper and something actually going through the process where it becomes a tool that everyone can use. And I think the example of this is like XGBoost. XGBoost was not a thing 10 years ago like it is today. And it started as, a very old idea about boosted trees, but it was a long path before you have this tool set that is extremely powerful. And people want to jump that so quickly because I think we're not patient. I mean, I see it too. I've made this mistake. I'm saying this because I've made this mistake a bunch of times where there'll be like, especially with like a new repo that comes out. It's like, Google came out with this great repo, blah, 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 and it's been out for 2 months and it claims to do all this stuff and you really want to use it. And then you're surprised when it has bugs or it's not quite the solution to the business problem that you had. And that can be a real, just a real friction in terms of trying to add value. Like you have to kind of just be like, when dealing with a business problem, what works? What are the tool sets that are known to work, that other people would attest definitely work, that people have ascribed, dollar impacts in other circumstances to those tools? Use those before you make some big bet. Because if you're making a big bet, it's got some really high probability of not being relevant at all. And I've actually had that experience a lot where I was like, oh, this tool didn't nearly do what I thought it was. I kind of was reading a repo ad,
Yeah. Well, I think that comes to, I sort of call it a triple bottom line. You're evaluating your models on accuracy, obviously, but also speed and predictability, right? Or stability or whatever you'd like to describe it. And I think a lot of us get really trapped in the accuracy and speed column. Yeah. And we don't necessarily think about how reliable it's going to be and how maybe resilience is probably the better. So I guess so before you talk about scalability is something very important as well. But, most of us, I wouldn't say it's like necessarily a problem with Kaggle, but like it's sort of a Kaggle mindset where you're trying to optimize for something and you're focusing on a singular thing. Whereas in a company in production, there's a lot of things that you have to focus on because you don't want to get a call like 8 p.m. one night. It's like, hey, like our model in production is not working. Like the API is not working. What's going on? And it'd be an issue that you can't possibly debug because it's something that's an infrastructure problem with the tool that you're using.
Yeah, it's like
it's definitely never happened to me before.
Yeah, like with Kaggle. I mean, I'm very impressed with Kaggle. It's the whole community. But one thing that Kaggle selects for is these big ensembles. At least that's my last exposure to it, because ensembles can, on average, they have these nice relationship to their constituent models. But in a production system at a big company, at least in my experience so far, they're just not used in production because an ensemble is just it can eke out a little bit more performance, but its dependencies, like if you're just using like each, it just creates a large surface area of dependencies that could be really problematic, and they're just terrible for production systems. Production systems, you want them to be fairly simple. Like you actually want them to be kind of linear, and when things break, you want to be able to determine exactly where that position is quickly, and that means it can't be this big complicated dependency structure. And that's just a component in reliability. There's a trade-off between the reliability and the debuggability of the system, and is it the top, best, most accurate model possible? And I think often it's not.
Yeah, I mean, you have to think like a lot of these, you obviously want accurate models, but at the same time, what do most companies care about more? I mean, it's like ease of use, speed of transaction. Like on Amazon, are you going to care more about if you're getting exactly what you'd want to buy on the website, or if it takes like a half a second longer to load the page or load the images or load the recommendations? You'd probably care more about like the load speed as an individual consumer. And obviously, like those teams are probably different, but I think that that's something that the best companies do well is they balance the engineering output with the user experience or with the like just like the overhead associated with the systems. And that's something a lot of other companies, probably more archaic ones, could aspire to do significantly better.
Yeah, it reminds me of when you see like a production system go down. The post-mortem that they always do is they're like, how much money did we lose for the system being down for 1 hour? And it's always some gargantuan amount. You're like, oh my God. So if you're going to insert an extra model in your ensemble that will get you 0.001 AOC or whatever, AUC, then that better be worth its additional probability that it incurred for downing the system, which can happen. And so if you do that post-mortem and they're like, it was this extra model, do we need that? Cut it out. And people are wise to that fact.
Yeah, well, I know that that's a massive constraint for data engineering. I mean, a lot of my friends are sort of in that space now, and you're talking about just downtime in terms of dollars and cents, and like infrastructure is really focused on limiting how much downtime or loss or any of these things you have.
Yeah.
And you do have to sacrifice some things for that. But if you're talking about things in terms of time or in terms of dollars and cents, it's pretty easy to make that calculation, surprisingly.
Yeah.
And it's refreshing that people are viewing it or learning it and trying to understand it in those ways. It's a little scary that it hasn't been thought of, in more dimensions previous, but at least we're making progress.
For sure. Yeah.
So I'm interested in how you made this transition from the hedge fund space into big tech. So obviously the company went under. What was your process like for applying, for interviewing, and getting out of that more traditional finance space?
Well, strangely enough, I didn't actually leave the company because it went under. I decided a year before I left, I was like, I'm going to leave. And then actually, as I was stepping out the door, the company was on fire. I was like, oh, that's good.
It's because you left, man. They needed you.
Yeah. So what happened was I, as a lot of people do in their careers, I sort of had a target point that I wanted to get to. And I knew, by this point, since 2014, I'd been hooked into machine learning. So I knew I wanted to do that. And I knew I wanted to just do a bigger and badder version of what I did at the hedge fund, which is, manage and build and manage a machine learning system that's delivering value. Like that's just going to be a valuable skill set over the long run. And so after the hedge fund, I was like, this environment, I don't think it's actually that conducive to this type of tasks. Just as a separate note, the signal to noise is terrible. So you're using a lot of linear models and it just wasn't as appealing. So I was like, all right, if I want to get to the really cool machine learning stuff, I got to get at one of these tech companies. So I spent a year building up the skill set. It was actually a really exhilarating time in its own way. I got Kevin Murphy's Machine Learning and Probabilistic Perspective. That book really did change my life. I kind of, the way I rationalized my last year at that job, it was like, I'm just going to spend the evenings getting through this whole book, putting it into notes, trying to build it into my DNA. And then I was like, if I know that, then I'll really stand out once I come to the interviews and start having conversations with folks. So I came out of this boutique hedge fund looking to go to these other companies. And I wasn't even getting an interview, which I thought was really surprising. And I think it's just because this wasn't part of their pipeline. Like now that I'm at these companies, I know that they have certain pipelines where they're looking for people. And if you don't come from one of those, you're not likely to get in. So I was like, all right, I need to make sort of a double step. And so I was like, what's natural between finance and tech? I went to fintech because I had experience with credit. So I went to a company called LendUp. I actually didn't really want to work at a credit card company. There's a lot of predatory behavior. But LendUp actually did, maybe I drank the Kool-Aid, but it had a really nice mission, which was to sort of develop the credit of people who had come onto their platform. So they would sort of give you layups in terms of credit actions. They'd send you push notifications. They're like, pay your $25 minimum and it will help your credit, and make sure not to miss that for this amount of time, and reduce your utilization, all this stuff. And they were like, we're going to try to build brand loyalty off of improving people's credit. They'll come to like us and that. And it was a great company. It had a great data science team. Really I was very impressed with just the backgrounds of a lot of the people there. Those people have gone on to like OpenAI and Google, and I think some persons at DeepMind now. Like really, it was quite a was quite just a set of data scientists that I was impressed with. They were doing great science. But, if I'm honest, I was like, this probably isn't my final destination. I want to go someplace else. And so that's what I did. After 12 months, I was like, all right, I've had my experience here. Now I actually want to get to a other company that I was more interested in. And then, I applied. And now that I'd done the startup world, something, fintech has tech in the name. Maybe that's what did it. I was finally getting attention from other companies. Oh, another thing that was useful. During that time, I'd also been writing on Quora. Quora used to be a platform that people were interested in. So that's where I got my first exposure to doing education just for the fun of it. And I would write, I wanted to push the envelope, write some really technical textbook quality stuff. And so that had gotten some attention, not a ton, but some. I put it on my resume, and then I started sending that around. And that actually worked very well. I started getting a lot of attention. I got offers from really good companies. And I think it was because I just had that thing, and they could click on that, and then they could find out about me personally very quickly. So they saw some personality. They saw that I had the technical skill set. And so that was a very different experience. Finally, the tech community totally welcomed me in. And I ended up picking Lyft, actually because Lyft, first of all, it was pre-IPO. It was a different environment at the time. But it also, their interview process was really rigorous, and that just spoke to me. They had, there are a lot of companies like this, but they had just an intense whiteboarding question about traversing graphs and doing all sorts of things. I felt like they were really pushing me there. They had a statistics interview where they asked me a ton of stuff, which I just thought was, again, they were really testing my limits on, or they were just checking that I was the person I was claiming to be. And then they had this 24-hour take-home machine learning task that I also found really exciting. So I applied to other places, and other places, the interviews were asking you to do a lot of SQL queries. They were asking you to think intuitively about the business, product changes, stuff that I just wasn't interested in. And then I get to the Lyft interview, and it's just can you build algorithms? We need it done, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, all right, I like this place. And then there were other reasons beyond that. So I ended up choosing Lyft, and it worked out. So
I really enjoy all of that, but I'm particularly interested in the Quora stuff.
Oh yeah.
I think that if you're a company looking at an individual, right, wouldn't you want someone that is helpful, right? Or is able to articulate and write things and explain things clearly? Isn't that essentially what a large portion of your role is looking at, doing code review, doing a lot of these other things, and identifying and clearly articulating and giving positive or, feedback in an effective way. And I think having an account on Quora, on Stack Overflow, contributing to public GitHub repos, those are things that if I had to put a finger on it, they have a massively disproportionate amount of value to you as a job applicant than a lot of the other things that you could be doing, right? How much more, it'd be tough to quantify, but having something like that on your resume over just another certificate that you might do, it's got to be an absurd amount of upside comparatively. And companies are looking for things that are action oriented, and that is definitely action oriented. It's taking initiative. It's identifying and in line with a lot of the skills that they're interested in. That's all companies are looking for. They're looking for, hey, can this person do the role that we want to the best of, better than these other candidates? And little things like that can have massively disproportionate benefits.
Yeah. Just thinking about it from the other side, when you're actually hiring the folks, often there's a hiring committee, and they're looking through your resume. And one thing that you should optimize for is it would be nice to have one evangelist. One person, generally that could be a referral, but you have to be sort of lucky and networks to pull that one off. But if you create an opportunity for someone to get to know you via a link in your resume or your online profile, your brand in general, it's not terribly hard to get an evangelist on the other side. Be like, this guy knows what he's talking about. I've read him online. He seems like he understands our subject. He will definitely add value to this place. it's not, if you have the skills, like, yeah, you have to develop the skills before any of this happens. But if you have the skill set, there's just, as you were almost saying, like so much alpha in putting it online that it's remarkable that so many people don't do it. And then if you have to rely on the more like typical routes where you're like, I went to a great college and I worked at a great company, you're still in a pool with, I don't know how many other people.
A lot of other people.
Like, I'm sorry, but there's a lot of people who went to Ivy League schools in this area. But if you have a well-constructed and you try to do good science in public, then you start more quickly becoming in a pool of one. And then especially a pool of one to your audience of whoever your people are.
Yeah. I probably harp too much on the communication skills in this space. But if you really think about it, our work is essentially useless unless we can communicate it effectively.
Yeah.
And how do we communicate the majority of the time in the workplace? It's actually through written communication, especially in the post-COVID era now, or like the current COVID era, where you're writing on Slack, you're writing emails, you're sending people information in that format. The fact that you can send someone a written piece of text that conveys information and solves their problems, that's a lot of the work that we do. Obviously, we're building models, we're doing some of these other things, but like, I mean, there is a tremendous amount of value in either your ability to clearly communicate through writing or orally, which is generally what I leverage heavier on.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you have the baseline technical skills, I personally believe that that's what most companies are looking for. And the other things that you can highlight are what they will actually land you the job, right? I look at, for most roles, 2 data scientists that are pretty good, their technical abilities are not going to be that different. Mm-hmm. What gets one hired over the other one is what separates them, whether it's a cool project they've done, whether it's subject area understanding, whether it's communication ability, the other stuff, they'd probably hire someone with less technical ability over someone that wouldn't talk to anyone else, right?
Yeah.
It just locks himself in a room and codes. So I think that, as long as you have that baseline skill, over-indexing on the other things will pay massive dividends.
Oh, for sure.
So I'm interested a little bit more in your work at Lyft. Mm-hmm. So like, what types of problems are you working on there, just from what you can share?
So I've been at Lyft since January 2019. And pretty much that whole time I've been working on forecasting. Maybe that's not quite, classic machine learning as people would think about it, but it's definitely a lot of statistics. And so more specifically, I do something called causal forecasting, which is actually, I'm convinced right now, it's like one of the most important business problems for any company out there. I'm not just being hyperbolic. So before I talk about that, let's just talk about how I might, sort of a definition of forecasting in general. So you have like some time series that defines like the health of your business. And as a forecaster, your job is to continue all those time series into the future. And you can say, hey, this is how many rides Lyft is going to happen next quarter. The problem with that is it only does that. It only continues the time series into the future. And there is an assumption there. And the assumption is that the statistical regularities over the past are going to continue into the future. Sort of like the status quo will continue on. For causal forecasting, you want to be able to consider counterfactuals. What that means is you don't want to just say what's going to happen if the status quo continues, but rather what would happen if you were to do a certain plan. So the problem with that is that a plan is going to almost certainly break whatever statistical regularities you were relying on in the past. So, for example, like how could this go wrong if you just said, causal forecasting doesn't matter, I'm just going to use my forecasting model for planning. Well, one thing that you might do if you worked at Lyft is you would see that price and rides are positively correlated. So you'd be like, wow, this is a nice correlation. So when prices are high, rides are high. And that's because we have a pricing algorithm that's in there that is charging higher prices when there's higher demand. So you see higher prices on New Year's Eve, a lot more rides, Halloween, a lot more rides, Thanksgiving, less rides. So if you use this for planning, you're saying, listen, I want to maximize profit at Lyft or whatever they're doing. Then you would say, okay, well, my correlational model says that I should increase pricing because that'll get more rides and I'll get more profit per ride. So I'll have infinite rides and profit if I just jack prices to the moon. That clearly doesn't work. So what you need is a causal model. And the real difficulty with the causal model is that the causation that you want to insert into the system doesn't exist in the observational data. This is like the whole task of causal inference. You have to be extremely delicate, at least, to look at the observational data such that you get causation out of it. But let's just take it as an approximation that there's no causation in the observational data. So then you have to kind of insert it from somewhere else. So the first thing that we use sort of Julia Pearl's way of thinking about causation, which is to declare a DAG amongst all your variables. And then that declaration of a DAG, of connections between variables, is a way of saying which variables cause which. So you say, like, if it's an arrow from pricing to rides, you're saying pricing causes rides and rides does not cause pricing. So that's one way of making an assumption. And it is an assumption. Stating the DAG amongst a bunch of variables is an assumption. And the way you figure this out is, well, the way we did it is we talked to team members, we talked to executives. We're like, how do you think about the business? Like, well, there's a demand side, there's a supply side, there's a market, and there's outcomes and blah, blah, blah. And you can kind of sort of infer the DAG from people's intuition. Things sometimes get a lot more specific when you're like, how does pricing work? You need to go actually look at the algorithm that generates pricing, and there's sort of like an implied DAG there. Anyway, so you sort of extract from your domain knowledge this big DAG, which enforces a type of causation on the variables. It basically constrains how the variables can relate to each other. And you hope that the true causal mechanism is in that smaller space where you've constrained things to. So that's one area. So that's one way of doing it. The second area is you actually just need experiments. So experiments, as sort of a way of thinking about them, tell you how things change when you change something else. So for example, an experiment that we might do is randomly shock prices. So, Lyft has some algorithm and we might shock it with some probability before every ride, so that we can get a sense of, hey, if we had made a slightly higher, more expensive ride, how much did we reduce the probability of actually yielding a ride, something like that. So we run that experiment. And what that experiment tells you is it tells you the causal coefficient between raising prices and reducing the probability that someone will take out a ride. So that's what the experiment tells you. It gives you like a parameter, a number, and it tells you kind of a delta or a slope or something that tells you about change. And then you bring that over to your model, and then you say, you tell your causal forecasting model, you're saying this model is causal if it agrees with this causal parameter that I got from the experiment. So I can build whatever forecasting model I like, but if I increase pricing by 10% or whatever, then conversion needs to change by X amount. And if it does that, it agrees with experiment, and then we've declared that this model, with respect to those two variables, is causal. So that's two ways: the DAG, the experiment. And then the third way, this is kind of sad, is, if you have the forecasting model that we have has a delta can exist between any two variables. So there's a lot of them. And the experiments and the DAG, they don't shepherd all. There's like a ton of deltas to keep track of. So the experiments and the DAG don't collectively do that good of a job of constraining all the deltas. So there's a lot of like unconstrained deltas that you sort of need to infer with other stuff. And those get inferred with your assumptions, things that you just, like when you were building your model, you were just saying, I think this is related to that. Like there's that type of assumption. And then everything else is just the observational data, which means we're going to fit every other parameter such that this model does a good job of forecasting the future. And that's all correlation. So you have to be skeptical of all the deltas that are sort of like unsupervised or whatever. But so this is a real, this process requires a lot of accruing. It just takes a lot of time. But over time, as you get more and more experiments into the model and you add more variables, then suddenly you got a big system that approximates the future and that you're safe to use for planning. And that's the exciting stuff. So that's what I've been doing for 3 years. And yeah, it's been really fun and useful and kind of hard.
So let me try and summarize. I mean, it sounds in a very cool way a lot like scientific research, right? Where you're going out and you're building a lot of these hypotheses about like causal effects from having conversations with stakeholders. you're going through, you're mapping relationships, you're probably creating some sort of hierarchy of these relationships, and then you're going through and essentially hypothesis testing them, and seeing which ones are truly valid in that sense. And then I would imagine, keeping the ones that are proven and using those in tandem with the observational data to make these types of projections. Is that like an overarching sort of top down? Is there any like fallacy in what I was describing?
No, what you were saying refers to a point in the process, for certainly. Whereas like you get the raw experimental data, and then you actually need to turn that into like a causal parameter, like that coefficient between conversion and pricing or something. And where you do the hypothesis testing or causal inference or any sort of that work, it gets done there. But by the time it actually gets to the causal forecasting system, we treat it as like a fixed, this is the truth of causation. And it only refers to two variables. We get that over there, get the model to agree with that. And then we just keep porting over as many of these deltas as possible. But yeah, so.
I see. So rather than a model, it's like a formula almost, where you're like.
It's funny that this wasn't my idea. My manager, Sean Taylor, who's he wrote Profit at Facebook, and this was kind of his brainchild. And actually, sorry, what was your question?
Oh yeah, so like a lot of it's probably more like a formula than like what we would consider a traditional machine learning model.
Sorry, I blanked
for that portion of it.
Yeah, so the way he would think about it was he would say all the whole model, if you could actually write it out like this big DAG, was just a big long equation. So because everything is functionally related to each other, and so what people are doing is they have this giant equation. Actually, like another way of thinking about this whole thing is actually as a structural equation model. That also works. Basically, like it's a big equation with a lot of parameters, a lot of observables, a lot of outcome variables, and then you're constraining pieces of it. You're saying for this model to be causal, these two things, this coefficient needs to be this certain value, approximately. Like this is, but yeah, that's one way of thinking about it.
That's amazing. I'd never really had any exposure to causal forecasting, so it's like I don't know, really interesting. Are there any articles that you have written or that you know of that might explain the concept as well, if people wanted to learn more?
Yeah, so we have 2 blog posts. They're on the Lyft engineering blog, but I'll include a link wherever necessary. There's blog 1 and blog 2, and it gets into a lot of depth about. There's a lot more to it, actually. I just went over the causal side, but there's this whole way of getting an organization to build components in parallel and all this stuff. There's a lot of like virtues in DAG modeling, especially at a big level.
So I have a question. Is causal forecasting something that any company could do, or is it essentially only achievable from technology companies that can A/B test or can like adjust their infrastructure to account for it?
I wouldn't say it's appropriate for all circumstances. So there's like one reason that rideshare is particularly good for it is because there's a causal structure that we're very concerned about, that we have a lot of observables about, and we're testing. So that's the marketplace. It's our interaction between riders and drivers and payment and pricing and whatever. And so that thing has certain causal relationships. A driver shows up to your house, picks you up, moves you someplace. Like there's a whole causal web that's way too complicated for you to actually model that exists. And we can observe very important pieces of it. And so that's just a big aspect of it. In another environment, like let's say the hedge fund space, it's not really useful because the only thing that matters is you really only care about the correlation between today and tomorrow. You have no control over, Warren Buffett might move the market, but he's not a lever that you can pull. So you just sort of push him off as some statistical object that is going to operate stochastically, and he's over there. And then your decisions, let's just say that you're a smaller hedge fund, are just going to be your positions. And you don't need to really factor in, they have some very negligible effects, but you don't really need to factor in the causal impact of your decisions and the market's reaction to it, because you can very easily approximate that with a simple formula of, the return on your stocks or whatever. So yeah.
Good. Correct me if I'm wrong. Like something like this would probably be very useful in a company that has a lot of vertical infrastructure, for example, that's
Oh
manufacturing
yeah.
multiple widgets, for example. Okay, cool. That's I think that's pretty interesting for me, and like also for broader data science is like, hey, some of these techniques from a business and value perspective, some of them are really useful to certain types of companies, to certain people, to certain branches, to certain infrastructure, and some of them, might not. Your company might not be suited for it, or it might not be ready for it, and that's like a broader thing that I think a lot of people don't understand is that we want to use this XYZ solution in my for my YouTube date for my YouTube business. I don't think it's going to be paying a ton of dividends.
Yeah, probably not.
Amazing. So I only had a couple more questions. I mean, one of them, obviously, you're very excited about causal forecasting, but are there any other types of concepts or techniques that you're very excited about right now?
All right, so maybe I just drank the Kool-Aid on this one, but I'm very excited about reinforcement learning. So just as a cheap plug, I'm currently working on a YouTube series it's going to be a 6-part series on reinforcement learning. I've been thinking a lot about it over the past year and a half. And yeah, so I'm extremely excited about this, particularly because of my experience in doing causal modeling. Just I'm like, okay, this starts to make sense. And the way I would kind of think about it is the reinforcement learning task is a very general task. I'm sure you may have seen it. It's got the agent, the environment. The agent picks actions. The environment gives you a future state and reward, and it's a very general construction that can sort of capture a lot of different types of interactions. So that's reinforcement learning. And then sort of, let's say classic machine learning is just like supervised learning, where you get matrix X, you get Y, and then you're trying to infer the relationship between X and Y such that if you're given another row of X, you can predict Y. Let's say you were extremely good at doing supervised learning, then you wouldn't necessarily be useful for all business tasks, because not all business tasks can be dissected into supervised learning problems. The real task of a company is a decision. That's really where the rubber hits the road. So even with perfect predictions, you have to push it a few steps further to actually get to your decisions. So I was thinking of an analogy that might work here, and this is a little bit, crude analogy, but I think it sort of works, which is you can think of a company a little bit like a robot. So imagine a robot in a kitchen trying to make some coffee, but the robot so far is just stumbling around in the corner. It's just kind of bumping into stuff or whatever, and it doesn't have a plan for making the coffee yet, but you'd like it to be programmed in a way that it ultimately will make coffee. So in that instance, let's say you were inside the mind of the robot and you were trying to come up with a plan. And the only thing that you're good at is supervised learning. You can only figure out strong correlations, and you do a really good job of getting rid of noise and figuring out correlations. Your observed data will be the model stumbling around in the corner, not making coffee. And it's pretty safe to say, removing the fact that you might infer all of physics or something, but it's pretty safe to say that you stumbling around the corner, there's nothing that you can label and figure out in that corner, which is going to be the coffee plan. What you actually need in the brain is you need a mechanism of sort of trial and error. So what you want the robot to do is to actually say, I'm not going to look at the data. The answer's not in the data. Who cares about supervised learning? Let me just try things kind of at random. And then if I'm good about sort of estimating the reward of that effect, like maybe I'm getting closer to making the coffee, or maybe I'm getting closer to the coffee pot or something, then you can kind of piece together what the actual solution is. So I'd say a company is often in that position of the robot. They have some historical behavior that really isn't their future plan, and they want to make coffee. And it doesn't matter how well they look at their historical data. They actually need a plan for experimenting in the wild. And so this is where my speculation comes in. Reinforcement learning as a science is very, the tools aren't super impressive right now. People aren't impressed with what the reinforcement learning systems are doing. There's things that you'll see from DeepMind will rely on a ton of simulation still, and they're for very discrete rule sets that are fixed. And no one is really seeing reinforcement learning work at the company level. But we're improving. Science is always moving forward. And so I think eventually, as the reinforcement learning tool set becomes more robust and more reliable, then companies will start to pick that tool set because its problem statement is the problem statement of the actual business. And they no longer need to use different collections of the supervised learning problem to try to figure out their answer. So this is where I think things are going if I had to make a speculation on the market. I'm seeing like little clues of that in different areas. And so that's what I'm excited about. And it is totally in sync with the causal forecasting work that I kind of do. It's even more so because the causal forecasting work, like its big gun is a lot of assumptions. It's just like get the domain knowledge from the people. And it would be really nice to not have that. And, it's this, beautiful idea of maybe we can come up with some super clever reinforcement learning algorithm, which can sort of implicitly contain causation in its actions over, making coffee. So I'm pumped about it. And there's a series coming soon.
I'm looking forward to it. When it comes out, I will also just comment it on this video, and we'll make sure it's available to everyone. I think reinforcement learning for me is very interesting as well. I look at it as, so we have unsupervised, supervised, and then I look at reinforcement learning as directed learning, where we're essentially, as the researcher, setting the parameters for what's important to the model. And although I think that there's a tremendous art to setting the proper parameters, and that's what's probably going to drive that field forward as well. Is not just the models getting better, but the actual parameter selection for what the models are trying to do. You're thinking of a video game. It's like, how do you build the best reward system to beat Super Mario or something like that, right? The actual reward system needs improvement, not just the approach of simulation or whatever it might be that you're using. And I think that's what I'm really looking forward to doing. I've been wanting to fool around with it for a while. My friend Nick Renault does a bunch of projects. He made a Street Fighter bot and some stuff like that. And I think I owe him. I'm supposed to make one too. And our reinforcement learning models will fight via Street Fighter, which would be really cool.
That's awesome.
I have yet to do that. So, amazing. So, the last thing I want to make sure we touch on is, how does YouTube and the content you create fit into all of this? I've watched your videos. I'm actually very impressed with the production quality, and I'm interested where, probably started with Quora, but I'm interested in maybe where that's going as well.
Yeah. Well, YouTube is a work in progress. I actually still look back at my things, and I've learned a few things since I first got started. And I'm like, all right, it's evolving in the right direction. So I'm very excited about it. And yeah, you hit the nail on the head. It's really a continuation of Quora. One thing that it served is, I started thinking about it when COVID hit, and one itch that it scratched was that, I alluded to this earlier. You don't want your job, if you're really interested in science or math or whatever, you don't want to put that pressure on your job to fulfill that desire. Maybe if you're really lucky, you're working at an AI lab where you can do that all the time. But for the average for the typical data scientist that's trying to add value to a company, that's not necessarily the best bet. You shouldn't try to just meet all your curiosities via work. It's just not appropriate. And so YouTube was an area where I could just be wide open. I could talk about anything that I wanted. It also gave me a great excuse to learn stuff. I used it as an excuse to learn all about reinforcement learning. I used it to learn about the exponential family or whatever. And, making these videos takes a long time, but you do feel that once you've done it, you have some ownership over the subject because you've spent so much time with it and you've looked at it from so many angles. And one thing that's important, one thing that's really useful for being in public is you try really, really, really hard not to be wrong. And there's a lot of checking that you do to doing that. And that makes you a good scientist over time. You're like, if I'm wrong in any way, someone's going to point it out. So you have to be very defensive. And so you find yourself asking the right paranoid questions that I think ultimately yield good scientists. So it's this form of public feedback. And it's a great hobby. I find myself thinking about it a lot. And, it's just a great way to augment my career. And I just get a big kick out of it. And the reaction so far has been, pretty good. And it's pretty much it. I don't have every reason in the world to do it.
No, I love it. Well, DJ, this has been an amazing conversation. How can people learn more about you? If people were to reach out, Is that okay with you? Is there a place that is best for them to do that?
Sure. So I'm sure we'll include maybe some links in the description.
Yep, absolutely.
The main way is to just go to my channel. It's called Mutual Information. So there you'll find everything you need. Basically all my videos. There I also have my LinkedIn and my Twitter. So I'm most active on the YouTube channels, not as of recent because I've been working on the series, but you'll find me there.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Great. Thank you.